the importance of these streamside and aquatic areas on your land, and a little bit of background about the aquatic ecosystems, about water quality, and about the habitat features that make a good riparian area. And I'm going to talk a little bit about beavers, but I noticed next week that Susan Barnes is also going to be talking about them. So I'll mention a little bit why fish love beavers, and mostly because beavers do not eat them. They're vegetarians, and they make wonderful habitat for fish. So and then a little bit about building in climate resiliency to your riparian area. I noticed that our next speaker is going to be talking about fire, and this, of course, is a huge subject now for all of us, and I'm really, really excited to hear his presentation as well. So the Willamette Valley is home to a variety of fish species. In total, there's around 25 native fish species in the Willamette Valley, and about as many introduced species. And so managing your streams and sections of your river and your wetlands and your ponds to benefit the native species, and hopefully discourage the introduced species. I noticed on the some of the materials that Sarah sent me, that one of the questionnaires that you took, that one of the biggest areas of concerns is uh, invasive plants. And so I'd like to sort of blend that into concerns for non-native fish as well, and how you can um, manage your streams and your sections of your property to encourage the native fish and discourage the non-native ones. And so this is just a few of a host of what I like to call the little native brown fishes that live here in the Willamette Valley. And let's see, I believe you'll be able to see my cursor. Is that correct? So this is a chiselmouth. This is a whitefish. It's next to it. It's a game fish. And this here is a peamouth. And then back underneath the chiselmouth is the sand roller, which is one of my favorite fish. And this is a speckled dace next to it. And then moving over one more, that is a juvenile large-scale sucker, which you may be familiar with the larger version of that. This long eel-like fish here in the middle, that is actually a brook lamprey. It is something of a cousin to the Pacific lamprey, which is, of course, getting a lot of attention now. And then this fish right here under the brook lamprey to the left, that is a sculpin. There's actually 5 different species, possibly even 6, of sculpin that live here in the Willamette Valley, and within those species, they range everything from very tolerant of what we would call degraded water quality, warm, low dissolved oxygen. They have a real tolerance for pollution. And then this fish here, this particular sculpin, this is called a torrent sculpin, and it is actually very intolerant of pollution and poor water quality. Here is the famous Oregon chub, which is just below the brook lamprey, and to the right of the sculpin. That is the first fish removed from the Endangered Species Act, thanks in large part to landowners like you. The species would have never been recovered without the efforts and work of private landowners to establish habitat for them. And this is the long-nosed dace, which is a dace species, but different from the speckled dace. These speckled dace you tend to find in the low-lying areas of Willamette Valley. These long-nosed dace you're more likely to find in the upper parts of the Cascade headwaters. Down here below the sculpin is the northern pike minnow, probably one of the most misunderstood and vilified fish species that we have. I meet people just all the time that tell me that they're in a non-native invasive fish, and they're not. They are a native fish. They are a predator. If you can see from this picture, there you can see that mouth there. That's a classic predator mouth on a fish. And yes, they will eat young salmon. But it's all about the ecosystem and the predator-prey interactions. And I really discourage people from vilifying these fish. They're a very important part of the ecosystem. And then this here is the red-side shiner, one of our most common and ubiquitous fish in the uh, Willamette Valley. And they're very tolerant of warm water and low dissolved oxygen. So you basically find them just about everywhere. And then here on the bottom is the three-spine stickleback, which just happens to be missing a spine. But this is one of the hardest. This fish is really hard to get a good picture of, and it's really a very pretty fish, but it just doesn't for some reason photograph well. So the species of fish here in the Willamette Valley are driven by Willamette Falls. And it's located there in Oregon City. It's probably been around since the Great Missoula floods, 12 to 15,000 years. And so all these little fishes that I showed you here, they would have all been here in the Willamette Valley prior to Willamette Falls being formed, likely when all the waters receded out of the Willamette Valley after the Great Missoula floods. And there are three species that will get across that falls. One is the spring Chinook salmon, one is the winter steelhead, and one is the Pacific lamprey. And those are anadromous fish that start their life in the Willamette Valley, and then they go out to the ocean, and then they return. And they historically could get over those falls during high flow periods. So the spring Chinook salmon and the winter steelhead migrate when the river's high. And the Pacific lamprey, on the other hand, they use their suction mouth. If you look back here on the this brook lamprey here, if you look at its mouth, it has a suction mouth like a Pacific lamprey. The Pacific lamprey is much larger than the brook lamprey, and it will use that suction mouth to just slither up the Willamette Falls, and they actually are quite good at crossing it rather than jumping like a fish, a salmon or steelhead. They'll just kind of work their way up with that suction mouth. So a healthy riparian area has certain components that make it a healthy area. You've got shade, you've got cover, and by cover, I mean, yes, cover over the river or creek that's providing the shade, but also cover with the tree branches that go into the water, with the tree roots that come down underneath into the water, trees that fall into the river. Those all provide cover. You're going to have nutrients from those trees and coming into the water and feeding the ecology. The trees are going to provide that bank stability. The vegetation on the ground, the grasses, the shrubs, the flowers, and also the leaf litter and detritus, if you will, that drops from the trees. That's going to provide a filtration that prevents runoff from coming into the stream. You're going to have the woody materials, the branches and the trees that fall into the river, and it's going to provide refuge from high creek flows that when fish need to escape that fast water. And it's also providing a lot of habitat for things other than aquatic species, for amphibians and reptiles and mammals that live in these riparian areas. So a healthy riparian area should look something like this. And you can see that there's trees all around it. There's grasses, there's small trees that are being recruited. In other words, if all you have is big trees, but you don't have any little trees, what's going to take the place of the big trees? So you have this very dense riparian vegetation. But sadly, many Willamette Valley streams look like this instead. The picture on the right, the trees have been removed. And there's not this connection between the creek and the land around it, what we would call a connection to the floodplain. So if you look here on the left, you can see the creek and the area of the bank is just about level. And so this creek is going to leave its channel and go out into that riparian area probably on an annual basis. And this creek here, on the other hand, or what this creek has been made into is what's called a conveyance ditch. The sole purpose of this is to just move water. That's the way this has been built. And so you can see it's all this distance here. So it might be maybe only once every 5 years, maybe even once only every 10 years when this creek will come out of its channel and get up onto the floodplain. So it's in riparian areas and good quality quality riparian areas are all about providing good water quality. Well, one of that is flow. Now, there's what we call a peak base flow. So how high does it get during a flood event, and then how low does it go when there hasn't been a lot of rain? And what happens when you have a creek like this one on the right is that when there's a big flood event like we had a couple weeks ago, there's nothing to hold this water back, and so you're going to have a high peak flow because there's no connection to the floodplain, and all the water is just going to go right down this conveyance ditch, and then it's going to drop very low again, where the creek on the left, when that water leaves the floodplain, it's ponded and it soaks into the groundwater, and so your peak flow is not going to be as high, and then your base flow is also going to be maintained. Now, I was just out doing some creek work this winter, and there's a stream in Salem, Croissant Creek, which is on the southeast side, and there's a very large impounded wetland just above where I was working. And then I was working in another section of a creek in Salem called Pringle Creek. And when we went out to do some surveys after a flood event, the water in Croissant Creek was higher. There was more flow in Croissant Creek than there was in this section of Pringle Creek, because through southeast Salem, Pringle Creek is just a conveyance ditch, whereas Croissant Creek had this large wetland upstream that was still metering out water and providing more flows to the creek. And there's a notion, or a misconception, if you will, that we have high flows in the winter and low flows in the summer, but in the case of Pringle Creek, for example, that water was very low because it had all washed away. So we can have very low creek flows in the wintertime when you have a highly urbanized, what we call flashy stream. So flow is more about, not just about how much water is there, but when it's there. And that then, of course, temperature. And the colder the water, the more oxygen. So this temperature of 45 to 65, that's a target for trout and salmon. As I mentioned earlier, many of our little native brown fishes are very tolerant of the warmer water. If you think historically, though, now these creeks that we see, particularly the one that I showed you earlier that doesn't have any vegetation around it, that's going to be warming up to 80, 90 degrees in the summertime. Your dissolved oxygen is going to be dropping to near zero. And about the only thing you're going to have in there is an invasive fish called a green sunfish that's very tolerant of low oxygen. Historically, that creek would have been supported year round by wetlands that were all around it. It would have had beaver marshes supporting cold water because while shade keeps water from getting warmer, it's going through the ground and going through gravel bars that make it cold. And so um, that's the link between temperature and oxygen. And so then there's pH, and just as we like a neutral pH, um, so do aquatic animals. And so fish and other aquatic life, if you get too basic, too high on the pH scale, or conversely too acid, too low on the pH scale, that's going to affect their physiology. And so they like that neutral pH just like we do. And turbidity, that's all about how much fine sediment there is in the water. And there's something of a misconception about turbidity. It's not all bad because those fine sediments can carry a lot of nutrients, a lot of biological materials, a lot of minerals and elements that feed that lowest level of the food chain. However, if you get too much and it starts to affect the fishes, or an aquatic insect that has gills, or a salamander that has gills, it starts affecting their ability to respire, just like a sandstorm or a fire. Think of the smoke we had and how hard it was to breathe when you went outside. That turbidity can affect the fish and other aquatic life in that way. Also, fish like to lay their eggs either directly onto the bottom, or they like to build a nest. So the salmon and trout and lamprey will build a nest in the gravel. A fish like a large scale sucker will just kind of broadcast spawn over a gravel substrate with these kind of sticky eggs. And if you get so much dirt in the water that it settles out and buries those eggs and prevents them from breathing, then you can kill the fish that are in those nests or along that gravel. So these are the little bugs I've been talking about. This is a stonefly, and these are little casings for caddisflies. The micro and macro invertebrates and the classifications that the scrapers, the filter feeders, gatherers, shredders, predators. Those are all this ecosystem underneath the water that the fish then feed on these aquatic insects, and there's also worms and things like little shrimp and scuds and so they're they take those leaves. So that's what a scraper does. Scrapers, getting the algae off the rocks. The shredder is the one that shreds the leaves up and eats them in little pieces. And of course, the predators are the like the stone flies that go around eating everything. And so it's this whole little ecosystem of aquatic insects and macro and micro invertebrates that are all part of this healthy stream ecology. And so this is an example when I talked about cover or shelter that the fish need. Everything likes to eat fish. And you've got your bigger fish, you've got your aquatic garter snakes, you've got birds like blue herons and water ouzels, and they're all going for those little smaller fish. And this is the type of cover that they need. These are just pieces of log and wood and branches and shrubs that are just down in the water and providing that cover. And then there's the healthy riparian area is going to supply this shelter during a flood. Now, a flood to a fish is just kind of like a hurricane to us. And when there's a hurricane, if you're smart, you go inside. And so the fish are smart, and they're not going to be out here right in this rolling turbulence trying to hold their position in this hurricane here. They're going to be over here um, hiding in this more quiet water. See how much quieter this water is here? That's where the fish are going to be. And that's why it's so important to have this connection to the floodplain. And the thing about it, the fish may only need it a few times a year. I mean, think how often when we've had maybe two flood events so far this year where I've seen the creeks move out away from their channels. Um, they may only need it for 5 or 7 days out of a year, but if they don't have it, that can mean whether or not they survive. And so that's why it's so critical to have that connection to the floodplain. So the kind of things that provide refuge, like the beaver marsh, a flood wetland is another place that fish can reside in higher flows. Seasonal streams, so smaller creeks, like for example here in the Albany area where I live, we've got a number of small streams: Periwinkle Creek, Crocs Creek, Truax Creek, and we've caught Chinook salmon in young juvenile Chinook salmon in all of those creeks, because when the Willamette River is flooding, they're going to seek those smaller streams out to get out of that big river flow. And it's also a good way for a little fish to avoid a big fish, is to go into a smaller stream where there's more cover, where it's harder for the big fish to catch them. Now, beaver, um, they impound the water, and fish need water. So it's pretty easy to see the connection. And for a long time, we humans in our silliness thought that these beaver dams were like a barrier to the fish, and we sort of ignored the fact that the fish and the beavers had existed together for millennial and got along really well. And so we used to take them out to increase fish passage. But fortunately, we got smarter, and now we're doing more and more that we can to encourage beaver. And there's a huge effort now to bring beaver back onto the landscape. And I'm certainly willing and happy to talk to that a little bit more at the end of my presentation if anybody is interested. So riparian zones can be these margins along the river. And this line here of where the creek is going to change. And then you have side channels, which will connect in higher flows. And this is once again about getting onto the floodplain, and that the fish may only need these side channels for a few days a year, but it's mission critical to their survival. And then you have the microhabitat. And this is an area that's really what defines a riparian zone. Well, it's this area where the river affects the humidity and the temperature, and that's where those specific plants grow that like the increased humidity, that like the more water. So, you'll find trees in this riparian zone that you may not find in the uplands. And you'll find trees in the uplands that you might not find in the riparian zone. And then you have the animals, particularly amphibians, that need that moist climate. And then, of course, the fish and the aquatic insects and macroinvertebrates that live under the water that need that water to live in. But that's what makes the riparian zone. And we all know this because we all know that we'll be out working working outside, chopping blackberries and fighting with the thistles, and you're just drenched in sweat, and you'll just walk over next to the creek in the shade, and you just like you just like it can be 5 degrees cooler in that riparian zone, even more. And that's what defines it, is what we call the microhabitat. And then the floodplain, where this is actually Mill Creek right there in downtown Salem, probably the 96 event, I'm guessing. And you can see there's a bench there, so it's probably where the walkway is, and a little interpretive sign. And so that's that area that we want the river to be able to move on to. So in-stream structures, just woody shrubs like these willows can provide that cover for fish, as well as food for beavers. You can actually place large wood into the rivers to provide that structure and all the benefits that come with it. There's just even the trees and the roots like this. I mean, if I went in there, I'd probably find all kinds of little fishes just hanging out right there in that cover of those trees and roots. And then you can do what are called rock weirs. And sometimes putting in wood isn't going to work because you're in an urban area. But you can do a rock weir, and it will provide some of that function that the large wood does. Fish passage is always important. We put in a lot of dams and culverts, and we didn't really think about how it would affect fish. And so Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife now administers fish passage criteria that requires any new culvert that goes in, any new structure that's going to block fish passage has to pass our criteria. And I'm happy to talk more about that later too. But I did want to point out that the first rules that prohibited the blocking fish passage on streams and rivers in Oregon was part of the original Oregon Territorial Charter of 1848. So Oregon has had rules governing fish passage on the books since before we were a state. So clean gravel, and this is where large wood comes in, and when you put a tree down into the river, you put a log down in the river, a log jam, that slows the water down as it moves downstream, and this provides cover for the fish, and it also gets the gravel here to drop out of those flows and make a gravel bar. And this clean gravel is really important for a number of reasons. One I talked about earlier, which is when the water goes through this gravel bar and comes out under the log jam, it can be 5 or 6 degrees cooler than the surface water. So a log jam is going to also create a pool underneath it. And I can be walking down the river on a survey, and I'll be ankle deep in water. The river might even be completely dry, and I'll come on a log jam, and here will be this deep pool underneath it, and I'll climb in, and I'll be waist deep in water, and I can feel in my feet, I can feel the cold water. And so these gravel bars are really critical for getting the water cold. It's also where these insects live. The caddisflies, mayflies, stoneflies, the little worms and the scuds and everything that the fish eat are going to be in that insect. It's also where the little fish live. It's where the salmon and the trout and the lamprey make their nest. We call it a red, and then they hatch out, and the little salmon and trout are going to be in those gravel nests for months. And then when they get big enough, they start moving around looking for food. That's where they're going to go back to if they feel threatened. They're going to go back and dive underneath those rocks. And so these areas of clean gravel are really critical for fish and for maintaining the healthy water quality. But the most important thing is appreciation, and caring, if you will, about these streams. And so that's why I really appreciate that you're here listening to my talk and that you're participating in this program offered through Marion Soil and Water, because it shows that you're already here. You're already here in the appreciation stage, and I thank you very much for that. And so now I have a question for you. This is taken from the Little Washougal River, actually, but I want you to notice here that there's a spike in fecal coliforms in August. And while there's the nitrates have gone down, the phosphorus is a little bit of a blip, but there's this huge spike in fecal coliform. And if you've ever seen the Washougal River, it's up in Washington. And if you walk up to it in the summer, you think, wow, what a healthy, clean, pristine river. Why, I'm just going to jump right in it and go swimming. And then you see this fecal coliform spike, and you might think differently. And I have a question for the group. What do you think is causing this spike in fecal coliforms in the middle of August in the Washougal River? So I'll just put that out to the group. Anybody want to take a stab?
Warmer temperatures?
Well, that's a good answer, but that's not it.
Someone wrote in the chat, people swimming?
No. So this is due to failing septic tanks. I'm not sure if somebody chimed in with that. Where's my chat? There it is.
We have cattle.
Cattle's also a very good answer too, but no, they think that this is caused by failing septic systems along the rivers. And that's another area where you guys can come in, because if you're living out in a rural area, you probably have a septic tank. And it's just really mission critical that you make sure that it's functioning properly and it's maintained. And because if it's not, all that nasty stuff is leaching into the groundwater and going right into your closest stream. So that's my presentation, and I am okay. How do okay, here we go. No, I'm trying to pause. Do I pause? Okay.
Can I ask, why does it only the fecal coliform go up in August and not?
Well, it has to do this has to do with flows. So in the wintertime, here in February, when there's a lot of water, it's diluted. And so if you charted the water would be going down here and it would be going up here. So in February, you have just as much in there, but you have a lot more water. And so then when the water goes down in the summer, then all those leaching septic tanks are going to, there's going to be less water to dilute it. And then you're going to get the, so I am trying to stop sharing my screen.
It says you stopped. It says that you have. Nope.
Oh.
Nope. Never mind.
Okay.
If you go down to share.
Well, I don't.
Oh. Go ahead.
Okay. I think I'm good. There we go.
Karen, there was a question in the chat. How is that
Yes.
information about fecal coliform related to landowners in the area?
So it's all about maintaining your septic tank. And I just use it as an example as you can do a lot of things to improve the riparian area and improve the in-stream habitat on your land, but then you might be missing a very critical piece of water quality is that one of the biggest drivers of pollution in the summertime in these small rural streams is in fact failing septic tanks.
I don't know that. Let's see. close this. How do I, let's share.
Is that Lenny? Are you on there? Who's listed as N9136? Okay, never mind. I guess we'll just open the table if y'all want to. You can turn on your video if you want so we can see you. And if you have any questions for Karen, by all means, bring them up. How many of us have a stream running through our property? Yeah. And how did your assessment go with the streams? Did you take a look at it? Did you see any issues?
So I could add that Sarah's provided some excellent resources in your materials for how to manage your streams and improve them. And there's also money available. There's the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board has what's called a small landowner grant program. And that's administered, is that administered through Marion Soil and Water in your area? Who does the OWEB small landowners in your area, Sarah?
So that can be us. That can also be the watershed councils, either the Pudding River or the North Santiam or one of the other ones in the area. And if you aren't in Marion, then it could be your Soil and Water Conservation District. There's a number of us around that do that.
I think
However,
is it 15,000?
Oh no, I turned it off.
Come back on.
You know, right now, I don't think OWEB, so OWEB was funded through lottery, and the lottery dollars, because of COVID, have been in as they once did. So I think right now they're on pause.
Well, no, actually, I'm on the OWEB review team, and thanks to, and I'm not kidding you, thanks to professional ping pong, sports betting on professional ping pong, when all the apparently when the basketball and football and everything shut down, that was what kept the lottery revenues up, and it's rebounded. Although quite you know, this last couple of weeks where the restaurants have been shut down again and bars shut down again in extreme counties, they may be having some revenue fall off, but actually the lottery revenues rebounded very well. And so OWEB isn't as crunched for money as they were concerned that they might be at the start. So I would certainly look into that. And the small landowner grants are good for smaller projects, but there's also our restoration fund, which funds the larger projects as well. So let's say, for example, you have a failed culvert or a culvert on your property and it's blocking fish passage, and you'd like to replace it maybe with a bridge or a low water ford or something like that that's going to allow fish passage. You want to do some work to put in some structures and plant some trees, you know, and you're all of a sudden you're up around the $75,000, $100,000 for the project. Then OWEB has that kind of money to fund those kinds of projects. And once again, reach out to your watershed council, Marion Soil and Water. I'm more than happy to talk to people about projects like that. There's actually a pot of money through Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife called Restoration and Enhancement that will contribute to projects like that. So there's quite a bit of money out there that can assist you with improving fish and wildlife habitat on your land. There's projects through our Access and Habitat program where they'll come in and clear properties of invasive species to encourage deer and elk habitat. There's wetland reserve programs that encourage people to retain impounded water on their lands, establish wetlands, so to help with water quality and groundwater. Natural Resource Conservation Service has programs. Farm Service Agency has programs. So, you don't have to do everything financially on your own. There's actually a lot of money out there to help you.
Right, and the Marion SWCD also has a program. It's typically smaller, although we do have some larger grants, but our grants are typically up to $7,500. And we can also help to put you in touch with other programs that might suit your project. I know that we have at least one person that in the class that has exactly what you're talking about. We've been looking at culvert replacement for a while on their property. But because of COVID, there was kind of a pause at OWEB. So it's good to hear that that might not last and that it might be time to start looking at getting that project through. That's fantastic.
There is a cycle open right now. So
Great.
they are entertaining restoration grants. And I'm not as intimately involved with the small landowner grant program. So I'm not sure where it is. I know it's got like periodic cycles. I think there's 3 or 4 a year. You probably know more about that than I do, quite frankly. But that's a really good option. I mean, it's up to $15,000, I think, that's my memory of it. And a 25% match, which can be in kind. So, you get $15,000 cash and then you agree to do the in-kind 25% match, by whatever to maintain your land, and so you don't have to put out that kind of money. In other words, yeah, it's a really good opportunity to assist you financially with those types of projects.
Jenny, did you have something to add?
Sure, Sarah. Christy Lucas does the well and septic programs, and I just wanted to mention she's with Oregon State University Extension Small Farms Program, and we've worked with her to do educational outreach on septic systems that may need repair, but she's a wonderful contact. So I put that in the chat and I can send you her information.
She is wonderful. She's a hysterical speaker.
I mean, when you get to talk about poop, who doesn't love that? It's great.
Yeah.
And Jordan had mentioned too, the programs that Karen mentioned, if those are in the resources. So that's a question for you, Sarah.
So we will include, we usually have a discussion at the last day of class about resources for getting projects funded. And we have some lists there. We also, as I say, you contact us and we can put you into contact with the various organizations or work with you to develop your project so that you can reach those resources. But yes, we will have something next week for you that kind of lists out some of those programs. We usually have this in person and we invite a bunch of people in and make a big potluck and all sit around and talk about funding projects and what everybody can do as far as helping you out. But this year it's going to be a little bit different. We'll make sure you get that information though.
I have a question. This is Lenny. I'm sorry I'm having so much trouble, but I lost how to get to where I can type in questions.
Okay, that's in the bottom. You'll see something called chat. It looks like a little talky balloon on the bottom of your screen. Do you see that?
No, but I just see the little dots like for screen. Oh wait, if I touch you, no, I know it's okay. I somehow I got it once. I'm sorry I'm always late. I keep thinking it's going to be dark at 5 o'clock. Okay.
It's all good. Do you have a question? All right. How about anybody else? Anyone with questions about their properties?
This is Lenny again. So I'm curious. We live on the little North Fork, and it's really a cliff. And I just wondered what kind of seeds or things would grow. I mean, it's really rocky and steep, and I think there were some fir trees that burned up. So kind of, hard to think about what to do. There's some protection so it won't fall away, but that's all I know.
Yeah, it's tough when you've got, a really steep rocky slope like that, and it never ceases to amaze me when you see these trees that will grow on something like that. And I guess they land as a seed, and they just take root and they start going. And I mean, I've seen them with their roots like growing across the rock face and down into the water, and just clinging to the cracks and crevices. And it's really remarkable. But I don't know how you could do something like that on your own, depending on what it looks like. You just kind of have to let nature do it for you, I guess. If there is any way you can get in there, I don't know, but I mean, it almost sounds like you'd have to rappel down or something with a tree seedling in your pocket. I don't know. It sounds kind of a little dangerous. You might want to just let it come back on its own.